The white passenger's voice rose loud enough for everyone to hear. "I don't care what her ticket says. That window seat is mine, and I want her removed now." The shrill voice of Bethany Caldwell, a white woman, cuts through the first-class cabin like a knife. Heads turn as this heavy-set woman in designer clothes points an accusatory finger at 16-year-old Zara Brednam, who sits quietly clutching her boarding pass. Zara replied, "I've already told you, ma'am. I'm not leaving because this is my assigned seat. Do I look like I care? People like you don't belong in first class anyway." Bethany's face reddens as she gestures with condescension and dismissively at Zara. "If you don't want to move, then I will call the flight attendant and security to get you out." Before Zara could reply, Bethany bent over to her and aggressively pulled Zara's cheeks, causing her so much pain. The young black girl stares out the window, her reflection showing a face fighting to maintain dignity under the humiliating assault. She clutches her phone as she texts her father, the only hope out of this situation. Have you ever been discriminated against and wished you could do something about it? Share your experience in the comments below. And if you stand against prejudice and racism, comment "No injustice" and your country's flag in the comment section and hit the subscribe button now, because this story gives the most satisfying example of instant karma you don't want to miss. Zara Brednam, a 16-year-old young girl, straight-A student, and someone who's learned to navigate life with quiet confidence beyond her years. Today was supposed to be different. For the first time since she could remember, her father had promised her 2 uninterrupted weeks of his time. This trip meant everything to Zara. A vacation with her father. While most teenagers spent weekends at the mall or scrolling through social media, Zara's life looked more like this. Monday through Friday, advanced placement classes, debate team captain, volunteering at the Children's Hospital. Weekends, academic prep, piano recitals, and often dinner alone with her father's empty chair, a painful reminder of the fact that he's not always around. Not that she complained. She understood her father's work was important, even if his absence left a void that achievements couldn't fill. Xavier Brednam, her father. At 47, he was one of the youngest division chiefs in FBI history, heading the counterterrorism division with the kind of quiet authority that commands respect without demanding it. The kind of man whose phone rings at 3 a.m. and presidents wait for his assessment. The kind of father who's missed more birthdays than he's attended. Xavier had promised this time would be different. 2 weeks, Zara. No phones, no emergencies, no agents calling me away. Just you and me. He'd made these promises before, of course, but something in his eyes told Zara he meant it this time. Maybe it was the guilt. Maybe it was watching his daughter grow up in photographs rather than in person. Or maybe it was the realization that soon she'd be off to college, and these moments would become even rarer. Their relationship was complicated, built on deep love but punctuated by long absences. Text messages instead of goodnight hugs, video calls on holidays, the occasional weekend when national security is allowed. The Brednams weren't just wealthy. They were the kind of wealthy that doesn't need to announce itself. It showed in the subtle details. The handcrafted Italian leather of their matching luggage, the ease with which Xavier arranged their first-class tickets, the casual way Zara mentioned their private beachfront villa in Bali, with its infinity pool overlooking the ocean. Money wasn't something they flaunted. It was simply the background to their lives, like the air they breathed. As they arrived at the airport that morning, Zara allowed herself to believe this trip might actually happen. 2 weeks of her father's undivided attention. 2 weeks to rebuild what his demanding career had slowly eroded. 2 weeks to be daughter and father, not just 2 people sharing the same last name and occasional dinners. Little did either of them know that before their plane even left American airspace, they would find themselves at the center of a confrontation that would test them both in unexpected ways, and reveal to everyone on board exactly who Xavier Brednam really was. The golden hour of boarding for Flight 1876 to Bali was well underway. First-class passengers were already settling in, including Xavier and Zara Brednam. Father and daughter moved with the practiced ease of frequent travelers, stowing their designer carry-ons in the overhead compartments before taking their assigned seats, 3A and 3B. Zara slid into her window seat, her favorite spot. From there, she could watch the choreography of airport ground crews, see the clouds during takeoff, and, most importantly, escape into her own thoughts when needed. Xavier settled beside her, their pre-flight ritual unchanged since her first flight at age 7. He'd quiz her on emergency exits, she'd remind him to switch his phone to airplane mode. Small traditions that bridged the gaps between their time together. "This is going to be an amazing trip," Xavier said, squeezing his daughter's hand. The genuine smile that crossed Zara's face was rare these days, a glimpse of the little girl still present in the poised young woman she'd become. That smile faded quickly when Xavier's phone buzzed. His expression told her everything before he even checked the screen. "It's Langley," he sighed, the weight of responsibility visibly settling onto his shoulders. "Dad, you promised," Zara whispered, trying to hide her disappointment. "I know, baby girl. It's a security briefing I need to sign off on. 10 minutes tops. I promise I'll be back before takeoff." The look they exchanged spoke volumes, her skepticism born from 100 broken promises, his determination that this time would be different. Xavier squeezed her shoulder before making his way down the aisle, already speaking in the measured tones he reserved for national security matters. Just as Xavier disappeared through the cabin door, the atmosphere shifted. Boarding was nearly complete when Bethany Caldwell made her entrance. 38 years old, expensively maintained, with designer clothing that seemed to be fighting a losing battle against her substantial frame. Her expression broadcasted irritation like a radio signal, and the flight attendants had already adopted the strained smiles reserved for difficult passengers. "I cannot believe how hot it is in here," she announced to no one in particular, fanning herself with her boarding pass as she lumbered down the aisle, Louis Vuitton handbags swinging dangerously close to other passengers' heads. When Bethany reached row 3, she stopped abruptly, staring at Zara with narrowed eyes. "Excuse me, you're in my seat," she declared, the statement leaving no room for question. Zara looked up, momentarily confused. "I don't think so. I'm in 3A. "Well, I have a window seat, and this is my row," Bethany insisted, her voice rising just enough to draw attention from nearby passengers. With the composed confidence that came from being raised by one of the FBI's top officials, Zara politely held up her boarding pass. "My ticket says 3A. This is definitely my seat." Bethany snatched the boarding pass from Zara's hand, examining it before thrusting it back. "Let me see your ticket, please," Zara requested, maintaining her composure despite the woman's rudeness. After a moment of theatrical fumbling, Bethany produced her own boarding pass, right there in black and white, seat 3C. "Aisle. There must be some mistake," Bethany huffed, color rising in her cheeks. "I always book window seats." "I'm sorry, but this is my assigned seat," Zara reiterated, her voice steady but firm. Something shifted in Bethany's expression then, a calculating look replacing the initial irritation. She studied Zara more carefully, taking in her appearance, her age, her race. The corners of her mouth turned downward. "Do you know who my husband is?" she asked, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "People like you don't typically fly first class." The implication hung in the air like toxic smoke. Several nearby passengers stiffened, uncomfortable witnesses to the ugliness unfolding. Zara's expression didn't change, Though something flickered behind her eyes, a hurt quickly masked, a dignity maintained despite the blow. She'd heard comments like this before, of course. At her private school, at country clubs, at academic competitions. The surprise wasn't in hearing them now. It was in realizing they still had the power to sting. Zara said nothing, simply turning to look out the window, her reflection showing a face practicing the careful neutrality her father had taught her. In the tense silence that followed, Bethany remained standing in the aisle, her substantial frame blocking passage for other passengers trying to reach their seats. Her chest heaved with indignation, designer scarf fluttering with each labored breath. This standoff wasn't going according to her script. The young black girl wasn't intimidated, wasn't scrambling to accommodate her demands, wasn't recognizing the natural order of things as Bethany understood them. For Bethany Caldwell, this defiance was unacceptable. "Flight attendant," she called out, her voice pitched to carry throughout the cabin. Her manicured hand shot up, fingers snapping impatiently as if summoning a servant. "I need assistance immediately." Madison, the flight attendant, appeared within moments, her professional smile firmly in place though it didn't quite reach her eyes. At 28, she'd been flying this route long enough to recognize trouble when she saw it, to categorize difficult passengers within seconds. Bethany Caldwell registered instantly as a Category 5 hurricane in designer clothing. "How can I help you, ma'am?" Madison asked, positioning herself to keep the aisle as clear as possible while other passengers continued boarding. "This seat is obviously mine," Bethany declared, gesturing toward Zara, who remained composed by the window. "She clearly doesn't belong here, and I need you to remove her." The implications in her tone were unmistakable. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the atmosphere growing heavier with each passing moment. A businessman across the aisle suddenly became intensely interested in his safety card. An elderly couple exchanged knowing glances, their expressions darkening. "I'd be happy to check both tickets," Madison replied, her voice betraying none of the disgust flickering behind her eyes. Zara handed over her boarding pass without being asked. Her movements deliberate and dignified despite the humiliation of having her right to occupy space questioned so publicly. Madison examined it carefully before turning to Bethany. "Ma'am, may I see your boarding pass as well?" With dramatic reluctance, Bethany produced her ticket again. Madison studied both documents side by side. "Miss Brednam is in her correct assigned seat 3A?" Madison confirmed, handing the boarding pass back to Zara with an apologetic smile. "Miss Caldwell, your seat is 3C, the aisle seat in this same row." Bethany's face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. "This is ridiculous. I specifically requested a window seat when I booked this flight. I always fly by the window." "I understand your preference," Madison replied, her tone calibrated to be soothing without being condescending. The difficult balance perfected over years of customer service. "Unfortunately, according to our system, seat 3A was assigned to Ms. Brednam. If you'd like, once boarding is complete, I can check if there are any other window seats available in first class." It was a reasonable solution, professionally delivered. But reason wasn't what Bethany Caldwell was interested in. "Absolutely not," she hissed, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I refuse to sit next to her. Find her another seat, or I'll have your job." The threat hung in the air, ugly and explicit. Madison's smile remained fixed in place through years of practiced customer service discipline, but something hardened in her eyes. Around them, the atmosphere had shifted. A teenager 2 rows ahead had his phone tilted just so, the camera lens visible between seats. A woman in a business suit pretended to be texting, but her phone was clearly recording. In the age of viral videos documenting public racism, several passengers had decided this incident warranted documentation. "Miss Caldwell, I cannot move another passenger who is in their assigned seat," Madison explained, her voice steady despite the threat to her employment. "However, if you're uncomfortable with your assignment, I'd be happy to see if we can accommodate you elsewhere on the aircraft." Bethany's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Do you know who I am? Who my husband is?" Without waiting for an answer, she leaned closer to Madison, voice lowering to a stage whisper still perfectly audible to nearby passengers. "Raymond Caldwell, Assistant Director at the Department of Justice. Perhaps you've heard of him?" The name drop was delivered with the confident expectation that it would change everything, that rules would suddenly bend, that deference would immediately follow. It was the card Bethany had played countless times before, watching with satisfaction as people scrambled to accommodate her once they realized the power her husband wielded. Madison's expression didn't change, though she registered the information. Assistant Director Raymond Caldwell, a name she vaguely recognized from news headlines, enough to know the claim might be legitimate. "I understand, Miss Caldwell, but our seating policy remains the same regardless of who our passengers are connected to," Madison replied with practiced diplomacy. Meanwhile, Zara had quietly taken out her phone, thumbs hovering over the screen as she considered whether to text her father. Part of her wanted to handle this herself, to prove she didn't need rescuing, that she could face this ugliness with the dignity and composure he'd taught her. But another part recognized that this situation was escalating beyond what should be reasonable to handle alone at 16. She typed quickly, "Dad, there's a situation in our row. Nothing dangerous, but unpleasant. No rush, but when you're done." Her finger hovered over the send button, hesitating. Her father was in a security briefing, possibly discussing matters that affected national safety. Was her discomfort worth interrupting that? She decided against it, saving the message to drafts instead. He'd be back soon enough. What Zara didn't know was that 3 rows behind her, one of the passengers quietly observing the scene, was Agent Teresa Lopez, an FBI field officer heading to Indonesia on the same security detail as Xavier. She'd recognized Zara immediately, but maintained her cover, watching the situation unfold with professional assessment. Her hand had already slipped to her phone, typing a secure message to her colleagues about the developing situation involving the director's daughter. Bethany, meanwhile, had escalated to a new level of outrage. "This is absolutely unacceptable," she declared, voice rising. "I want to speak to the captain immediately. This girl has clearly forged her ticket. There's no way she legitimately has a first-class seat." The accusation of forgery, of criminal behavior, crossed a line. Madison's professional demeanor finally cracked just slightly, her spine straightening as she prepared to shut this down decisively. "Miss Caldwell, that is a serious and unfounded accusation. Ms. Brednam's ticket was issued properly through our system and verified by gate agents before boarding. I must ask you to take your assigned seat or I will need to involve our air marshal." The mention of law enforcement caused a flicker of hesitation in Bethany's expression, but it quickly hardened into renewed determination. She was too committed to back down now, too convinced of her rightness, too accustomed to the world bending to accommodate her demands. "Call security," she demanded, voice trembling with indignation. "Call them right now. I want this investigated immediately." What Bethany Caldwell couldn't possibly know was that security was indeed about to become involved, just not in the way she imagined. And that the man whose name she so confidently dropped as a weapon was about to become the very reason her world would come crashing down around her designer shoes. Have you ever encountered someone who used their connections or status to try to intimidate you? What happened, and how did you respond? Share your stories in the comments below, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe now. As the confrontation in first class reached a fever pitch, Madison made a decision. This situation had escalated beyond her authority to manage, beyond the usual passenger disputes over armrests or reclined seats. With a discreet hand signal to her colleague, she initiated the protocol for serious cabin disruptions. "I'm going to speak with the captain," she informed both parties, her voice carrying the weight of finality. "Please remain in your assigned seats until this matter is resolved." As Madison made her way to the cockpit, the cabin hummed with tension. Passengers exchanged glances, some openly filming now, others pretending not to notice while absorbing every detail. Meanwhile, in a secured conference room deep within the airport's restricted zone, Xavier Brednam stood at the head of a table surrounded by 8 of his top agents. The room was soundproofed, swept for electronic surveillance, and guarded by 2 additional agents outside. On the table before them lay detailed intelligence briefings on potential threats to American interests. "The authorities have confirmed increased chatter around tourist destinations," Xavier explained, his voice carrying the measured gravity that had become his professional signature. "While there's no specific threat, I want our presence to be felt but not obvious. We're on vacation, officially. Unofficially, I need eyes and ears at all major locations." The agents nodded in understanding. This was the delicate dance of counterterrorism work, being present without creating panic, vigilant without disrupting civilian life. Each agent at the table was elite, selected not just for their tactical skills, but for their ability to blend seamlessly into tourist environments. As the briefing continued, Xavier felt his phone vibrate in his pocket. Once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession. Years of experience had taught him to distinguish between the vibration patterns of different notifications. These weren't emails or news alerts. These were text messages, multiple in a row. Given the limited number of people who had access to his personal number, this triggered an immediate internal alert. He discreetly checked his screen while Agent Winters continued reviewing evacuation protocols. 3 messages from Agent Lopez, all marked urgent. The first made his blood run cold. Situation developing with Zara on aircraft. Racist passenger confrontation escalating. Captain being called. Xavier's expression betrayed nothing as he read the messages, but inside 2 powerful forces collided. The FBI director responsible for a critical security briefing, and the father whose child was facing harassment. It was the eternal conflict that had defined his career as a single parent in a high-stakes position. "Winters, take over the briefing," he instructed, his tone leaving no room for questions. "Complete the operational assignments and rendezvous on the aircraft. I need to return to the plane immediately." The team recognized the shift in their director's demeanor, the subtle transformation from measured to urgent. They'd all worked with him long enough to know that very few things could interrupt a security briefing of this importance. Whatever was happening on that plane, it was serious. Back on the aircraft, the situation had deteriorated further. The captain, a veteran pilot named Michael Harrington with 30 years of commercial aviation experience, had emerged from the cockpit to assess the disruption delaying his departure. At 58, Captain Harrington had seen almost every type of passenger conflict imaginable, but the naked prejudice displayed in this confrontation made even him uncomfortable. "Ladies, what seems to be the problem?" he asked, his authoritative presence temporarily quieting the heated exchange. Before Madison could provide context, Bethany Caldwell seized the opening. "Captain, thank goodness," she exclaimed, her voice dripping with manufactured relief. "This girl has taken my window seat and your flight attendant is refusing to correct the situation. My husband runs the Justice Department, and I can assure you this kind of treatment will not be tolerated. This girl needs to be removed immediately." Captain Harrington turned to Madison, who quickly explained the actual situation, both passengers' assigned seats, the verification of their boarding passes, and Bethany's escalating demands and threats. "Miss Caldwell, the captain said after listening carefully. "I understand you're disappointed about not having a window seat, but our assignments are final once boarding passes are issued. Miss Brednam is in her correct seat." Bethany's face contorted with frustration. The narrative she'd constructed, that she was the victim of poor service, that her status entitled her to special treatment, was collapsing around her. In desperation, she pivoted to a new approach. "I don't feel comfortable or safe sitting next to her," Bethany declared loudly, ensuring other passengers would hear. "As a taxpayer and the wife of a senior government official, I demand different accommodations." The implication was clear. Her discomfort stemmed not from legitimate safety concerns, but from the race of her seatmate. The statement hung in the air, its ugliness impossible to disguise with polite euphemisms. Throughout this exchange, Zara had maintained her silence, retreating into the protective emotional shell that children of public figures often develop. But something about this last statement, the blatant prejudice, the invocation of taxpayer status as if it granted special rights to demean others, finally broke through her composure. "My father will be back soon," she said, her voice quiet but steady, carrying the unmistakable confidence of someone who knows exactly who they are and what support stands behind them. "Please just leave me alone until then." It was a simple statement of fact, not a threat. But it was the first time Zara had directly engaged since the initial seat verification. All eyes turned to her, several passengers noting the dignity with which the teenage girl handled herself in the face of such hostility. Bethany, however, saw only an opportunity to mock. "Oh, I'm terrified," she exclaimed with theatrical sarcasm, placing a hand over her heart in mock fear. "Who's Daddy? A baggage handler? The man who cleansed the toilets?" Her laughter was sharp, meant to wound. "Listen, little girl, whatever your father does, he doesn't have the authority my husband wields. Raymond Caldwell can make people disappear with a phone call." The threat, thinly veiled as it was, caused Captain Harrington's expression to harden. "Miss Caldwell, I must warn you that threatening other passengers—" His reprimand was interrupted by a sudden shift in the cabin's atmosphere. Like animals sensing a predator, passengers fell silent, attention drawing to the front of the first-class section, where a commanding figure had appeared. Xavier Brednam stood in the entryway, still dressed in the impeccable suit he'd worn to his security briefing. At 6'2", with the athletic build of someone who maintained rigorous physical training despite his administrative position, his presence filled the space in a way that went beyond mere physical dimensions. It was the quiet authority he carried, the focused intensity of his gaze as it swept the cabin and locked onto the confrontation in row 3. As Xavier moved purposefully down the aisle, a remarkable thing happened. In seats scattered throughout first class, 4 individuals straightened almost imperceptibly. Agent Lopez 3 rows back, Agent Chen near the window in row 7, Agent Rodriguez in the last row, and Agent Patel by the galley. Though they made no obvious movements, their alertness level shifted in perfect synchronization with their director's arrival. They were a team, suddenly visible after hiding in plain sight. Captain Harrington's eyes widened slightly as he recognized Xavier. Not from media coverage, as the FBI counterterrorism chief rarely sought publicity, but from the high-level security briefings that senior pilots received. This was no ordinary passenger returning to his seat. This was one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the United States. "What's happening here?" Xavier asked, his voice deceptively quiet, yet carrying an undercurrent of authority that silenced the entire cabin. His eyes moved from his daughter to Bethany Caldwell to the captain, assessing the situation with the rapid precision of someone trained to evaluate threats in seconds. Zara's expression betrayed nothing to casual observers, but Xavier could read the subtle signs of her distress, the slightly too perfect posture, the controlled breathing pattern she used when upset. the way her fingers curled against the armrest. His daughter was practicing exactly what he'd taught her about maintaining composure under pressure. And while professionally that made him proud, paternally it made his blood boil. As Captain Harrington began explaining the situation, Xavier's focus narrowed onto Bethany Caldwell with laser precision. He recognized the type immediately. Someone who weaponized connections and status, who believed rules existed for others. Someone who had likely spent years dropping her husband's name to intimidate service workers and gain unearned advantages. The irony that she had chosen today, this flight, and his daughter as her target would have been almost amusing if it weren't so infuriating. What Bethany Caldwell couldn't possibly know was that Raymond Caldwell, the man whose name she so carelessly wielded as a threat, had been appointed to his position at Xavier's specific recommendation. They met monthly for security briefings, where Raymond deferentially addressed Xavier as Director Brednam. As Xavier stood in that aisle, the confrontation had reached its turning point. Two worlds were about to collide. The privileged bubble Bethany Caldwell had constructed around herself, and the reality of consequences that Xavier Brednam represented. In seconds, everything would change, and not a single person on that aircraft would ever forget what they were about to witness. If you're enjoying the story, don't forget to click the subscribe button to enjoy more of this. Time seemed to slow as Xavier Brednam moved through the cabin toward his daughter. His footsteps were measured, deliberate. The walk of a man who never needed to rush because power naturally waited for him. The ambient noise of the aircraft faded to nothing as passengers sensed the gravitational shift occurring in their midst. Bethany Caldwell remained oblivious to the approaching storm, still ranting to the captain about her husband's importance, about how she'd demand an investigation into this discriminatory treatment. The words tumbled from her lips with practiced indignation, a performance she'd given countless times before when reality failed to bend to her expectations. And when Raymond hears about this, he'll have her badge and yours. Do you have any idea the kind of clearance my husband has? The kind of people who answer his calls? Xavier paused at the edge of row 3, allowing her to continue digging the hole she'd never escape from. His expression revealed nothing, a skill honed through years of interrogations and high-stakes negotiations. Only the subtle tightening of his jaw betrayed the fury building beneath his professional veneer. As he reached the row where his daughter sat, something extraordinary happened throughout the cabin. Like a choreographed sequence that had been rehearsed to perfection, 4 individuals in different parts of the first-class section stood simultaneously. Agent Teresa Lopez from row 6. Agent Marcus Chen from by the window in row 7. Agent Daniela Rodriguez from the last row. Agent Raj Patel positioned near the galley. They rose without fanfare, without announcement. 4 impeccably dressed professionals whose postures and alert gazes instantly identified them as law enforcement to anyone with the experience to recognize such things. They didn't draw weapons or make aggressive movements. They simply stood establishing their presence and alertness with silent precision. Their director was around, and all had to stand to respect him. The synchronized movement created an immediate effect. Conversations ceased mid-sentence. Passengers who had been pretending not to notice the confrontation now stared openly. Even the ambient sounds of the aircraft seemed to diminish as complete silence fell across the cabin. Everyone sensed that something significant was unfolding, something beyond the usual drama of commercial air travel. Captain Harrington's expression shifted from professional concern to immediate recognition as he registered Xavier's presence. 25 years as a commercial pilot had included enough security briefings for him to instantly identify one of the nation's top security officials. Director Brednam, the captain said, his tone shifting to one of profound respect. I apologize for the disturbance involving your daughter. We were just resolving the situation. The word director landed like a thunderclap in the silent cabin. Bethany's head snapped toward Xavier, her expression still clutching at indignation, even as confusion began to seep in. The title registered, but its implications hadn't yet penetrated her certainty that she was the most important person in this scenario. With deliberate calm, Xavier reached into his jacket and withdrew his credentials, allowing the FBI shield to catch the cabin lighting as he briefly displayed it before returning it to his pocket. The gesture wasn't theatrical. It was simply confirmatory, a formality for a man whose authority typically preceded him. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Bethany Caldwell's face. The pieces were beginning to assemble in her mind, though the full picture remained just beyond her grasp. She looked from Xavier to the captain, to the agents now positioned throughout the cabin, her brain scrambling to recalibrate a scenario spinning rapidly beyond her control. "I don't understand what's happening," she said, her voice losing its strident confidence. "Who are you people? Why are you surrounding me?" Xavier's response came with the quiet precision of a surgeon's blade. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, pronouncing her name with perfect clarity to ensure there could be no misunderstanding, "I believe you know my name, even if you don't recognize my face. Your husband certainly does." A pause. Perfectly timed. "Your husband, Raymond, reports directly to me." The color drained from Bethany's face so rapidly that passengers several rows away could observe the transformation. Her expression collapsed from righteous indignation to dawning horror, as the implications cascaded through her consciousness. The husband whose name she'd been weaponizing throughout this confrontation, the source of her perceived power and untouchability, reported to the father of the girl she'd been harassing. That's not possible," Bethany stammered, though her expression betrayed that she knew it was not only possible, but catastrophically true. "Raymond would have told me if he..." "If he what, Mrs. Caldwell?" Xavier asked, his voice remaining measured even as it carried an undercurrent of steel. "If he worked under the father of the young woman you just suggested should be cleaning toilets? If his career advancement depended on the man whose daughter you accused of forging documents and not belonging in first class?" Bethany's mouth opened and closed without producing sound, the perfect picture of a predator suddenly recognizing itself as prey. "I've heard everything you've said to my daughter," Xavier continued, his gaze never wavering. "Every word, every implication, every threat." The entire cabin held its breath. Flight attendants stood frozen in the aisles. Passengers who had been recording the confrontation continued to do so with renewed intensity, recognizing they were witnessing something extraordinary. Even the ambient sounds of the aircraft seemed muted, as if the plane itself were listening. Bethany's face completed its transformation from smug entitlement to abject terror. The realization that she had spent the last 20 minutes threatening, demeaning, and attempting to intimidate the daughter of her husband's superior, a man who apparently commanded a team of federal agents who traveled with him, hit her with the force of a physical blow. Her skin took on a grayish pallor, perspiration beading visibly along her hairline despite the cabin's air conditioning. I didn't know she was your daughter, sir," she whispered, the words barely audible. "I would never have." "Never have what exactly?" Xavier asked, the question hanging in the air between them like a blade. "Never have demanded that my daughter be removed from her assigned seat because you wanted it? Never have suggested she didn't belong in first class? Never have threatened to have flight staff fired for following proper procedures? Never have invoked your husband's name to intimidate others if you'd known someone with greater authority was listening?" Each question landed with precision, dismantling the framework of excuses before Bethany could fully construct them. This wasn't just a dressing down. It was a methodical deconstruction of privilege by someone who had spent a career identifying and neutralizing threats. "Mrs. Caldwell," Xavier said, his tone shifting to something even more formal, "I've just been informed that your husband is currently being notified of this incident." The statement hung in the air for a moment before its full implications registered on Bethany's face. Whatever remained of her composure crumbled completely. The realization that Raymond, her source of perceived power, her shield against consequences, was at this very moment learning about her behavior toward his boss's daughter seemed to physically diminish her. The cabin remained in absolute silence, the collective audience to a drama more compelling than anything the in-flight entertainment system could possibly offer. This was justice unfolding in real time, the rare and satisfying spectacle of entitlement meeting its perfect counterbalance. For Zara, watching from her window seat, the moment carried complex emotions. The vindication was undeniable, seeing her father's authority protect her when so often it had taken him away. In that suspended moment, with all eyes upon Xavier and absolute authority at his disposal, he stood at a crossroads that would define him in the eyes of everyone watching, especially in the eyes of his daughter. The weight of revelation hung in the cabin like a physical presence. The understanding that power dynamics had shifted irrevocably, that the woman who had spent the last 30 minutes wielding her husband's name as a weapon now found herself at the mercy of someone with exponentially greater authority. For perhaps the first time in her adult life, Bethany Caldwell confronted a situation she couldn't bully, intimidate, or purchase her way out of. Watching the realization dawn across her features was like witnessing a time-lapse of emotional collapse, from entitlement to shock, to mortification, to desperate self-preservation. The transformation was so complete that several passengers who had been recording the confrontation continued filming, sensing that whatever came next would be equally compelling. "Director Brenham," Bethany began, her voice now stripped of all its previous arrogance, replaced with a tremulous attempt at contrition. "I had no idea who you were. This has all been a terrible misunderstanding. If I had known that she was your daughter—" Xavier raised his hand slightly, the gesture halting her words mid-sentence with more effectiveness than a shout could have achieved. The movement was minimal, controlled, like everything about the man. Yet its authority was absolute. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, his voice calibrated to be heard by everyone in the immediate vicinity without seeming to address the entire cabin, "let me be very clear. The fact that Zara is my daughter is irrelevant to how any human being should be treated. Your behavior would be equally unacceptable if directed toward any passenger on this aircraft." The rebuke was delivered without a raised voice, without theatrical gestures, yet its impact visibly registered on Bethany's face like a physical blow. This wasn't the negotiation she had expected. This wasn't a powerful man protecting his own out of nepotism. This was something altogether more principled, and therefore more devastating to her worldview. "I'm so sorry," Bethany stammered, perspiration now visibly dampening her designer blouse, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. "I truly apologize for my behavior. It was inexcusable." Xavier's expression remained impassive, his gaze never wavering from Bethany's face. When he spoke again, his words carried the measured precision of someone accustomed to choosing them with extreme care. "Your apology isn't owed to me, Mrs. Caldwell. It's owed to my daughter." The directive hung in the air, simple, non-negotiable, and perfectly calibrated to extend Bethany's public humiliation while simultaneously empowering the young woman who had been the target of her bigotry. It was justice distilled to its essence, forcing Bethany to acknowledge Zara's humanity directly, rather than addressing her through intermediaries or pretending she was invisible. Bethany turned slowly toward Zara, her face a battlefield of conflicting emotions. resentment at being forced into this position, warring with the desperate need to somehow mitigate the damage she'd done to her husband's career. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry for how I spoke to you. It was inappropriate." The apology was grudging, minimal, falling well short of acknowledging the racist underpinnings of her behavior. Xavier remained silent, his steady gaze making it clear the performance was inadequate. Under the weight of that collective scrutiny, Bethany tried again. "I apologize for suggesting you didn't belong here," she said, each word seeming to physically pain her. "And for the things I said about your father. I was completely out of line." Throughout this forced apology, Zara maintained the composed dignity that had characterized her response to the entire confrontation. At 16, she displayed more maturity and self-possession than the middle-aged woman now stumbling through her reluctant contrition. When Bethany finished speaking, Zara simply nodded once, neither verbally accepting the apology nor rejecting it, but acknowledging that it had been offered. Captain Harrington, who had been observing the exchange with professional interest, stepped forward to address Xavier directly. "Director Brednam, given the nature of this incident, I'm prepared to have Ms. Caldwell removed from the flight if you feel that would be appropriate," he offered, his tone making it clear that this was entirely at Xavier's discretion. "We take passenger comfort and safety very seriously, especially in cases involving harassment." The offer hung in the air, the possibility of ultimate public humiliation for Bethany, of being escorted off the aircraft in front of hundreds of passengers who would inevitably share the story on social media within minutes. The career and social implications would be devastating, extending far beyond this single flight. Everyone in the cabin seemed to hold their breath, waiting for Xavier's decision. His response, when it came, surprised many observers. "That won't be necessary, Captain," Xavier said, his voice level. "We can all be civil adults for the duration of this flight." He turned slightly toward Bethany, his gaze unflinching. "I'm certain Mrs. Caldwell understands the importance of respectful behavior going forward." It wasn't mercy, not exactly. It was calculated restraint, the kind that demonstrated true power more effectively than any punitive display could have. By declining the opportunity for public retribution when it was clearly within his grasp, Xavier elevated himself further above Bethany's petty tyranny. The contrast between her behavior and his response could not have been more stark. "However," Xavier continued, "I do believe alternative seating arrangements would be appropriate under the circumstances." Madison, who had been standing nearby throughout the confrontation, stepped forward immediately. "We can accommodate Miss Mona Caldwell in economy, if that works for you, Director." Bethany's expression crumpled at the suggestion of being relegated to economy class, a final humiliation that struck directly at the heart of the status consciousness that had driven her behavior from the beginning. But she offered no protest, recognizing that any objection would only worsen her already precarious situation. As Madison prepared to escort Bethany to her new seat, a flight attendant from economy appeared in the first-class cabin, leaning forward to whisper something to her colleague. After a brief exchange, Madison turned to Xavier. "Director, we have an elderly passenger in economy who's having difficulty with the limited legroom due to recent knee surgery. Would you object if we offered Miss Caldwell's first-class seat?" A flicker of something, perhaps the ghost of a smile, passed across Xavier's otherwise composed features. "I think that would be an excellent solution." And so it was that Bethany Caldwell, who had been so certain of her entitlement to preferential treatment, found herself escorted to a middle seat in economy, while her first-class accommodation was given to an elderly woman with a walking cane who couldn't believe her good fortune. The symmetry of the exchange was lost on no one, least of all on the passengers who continued to document every moment of the resolution. As Bethany disappeared down the aisle toward economy, physically diminished by her humiliation, Xavier turned to his team and gave a subtle nod. A silent command, immediately understood and obeyed. The agents who had risen throughout the cabin returned to their seats with the same synchronized precision with which they had established their presence. They remained alert but unobtrusive, professionals resuming their cover as ordinary travelers. Only then did Xavier finally take his seat beside his daughter. The immediate crisis resolved, but the emotional aftermath still hanging in the air between them. As the flight attendants prepared for imminent departure, father and daughter sat in silence for several moments, both processing what had just occurred. Zara was the first to speak, her voice pitched for her father's ears alone. "You didn't have to do all that," she said quietly, though her eyes betrayed how much his intervention had meant to her. "I could have handled it." "I know you could have," he replied with equal quietness. "You were handling it beautifully, with more dignity and restraint than I might have shown at your age." A pause, weighted with recognition. "But you shouldn't have to handle it alone. Not when I'm here." The simple declaration, "not when I'm here," hung between them, loaded with the acknowledgement of how often he hadn't been. How many school events, competitions, difficult moments had passed without his presence, because national security had claimed priority. There's a difference between standing up for yourself and having to face bigotry alone, Xavier continued, the conversation shifting to something deeper, more meaningful than the incident that had precipitated it. Dignity isn't about absorbing abuse in silence. It's about knowing your worth so completely that other people's attempts to diminish it can't touch you. "Like you just did with her?" Zara asked, nodding toward the economy section where Bethany had disappeared. "You could have had her removed from the flight. Everyone saw it. But you didn't." Xavier considered this, choosing his words carefully. Power isn't about what you can do to others. It's about what you choose not to do when you have every justification. A thoughtful pause. "Remember that, Zara. The true measure of authority isn't how much punishment you can inflict, it's how much restraint you can exercise when provoked." The conversation deepened as the aircraft began its taxi toward the runway, father and daughter connecting in ways that had become increasingly rare as his responsibilities grew and her childhood receded. They spoke of privilege and its blind spots, of the double standards Zara navigated daily, of the complex responsibility that came with Xavier's position. "I'm proud of you," Xavier said finally, the words simple but profound in their sincerity. "Not because you're perfect, but because you're becoming someone who stands firm in her principles, even when it would be easier not to." Zara's expression softened, her customary reserve giving way to genuine emotion. "I learned from watching you." As the plane accelerated down the runway, lifting them toward clouds and the promise of Bali beyond, Xavier made a decision that had been forming in his mind since witnessing his daughter face discrimination alone. "This vacation is going to be different," he said, the declaration carrying the weight of a vow. 2 weeks. No emergency calls, no briefings, no crises pulling me away. Just us. The skepticism in Zara's eyes was understandable. She'd heard similar promises before, had learned to protect herself from disappointment by expecting interruptions. But something in her father's tone, in the resolute set of his jaw, suggested this time might actually be different. "You mean it?" she asked, not quite daring to believe. "I've already instructed my team," Xavier confirmed. "Anything short of imminent terrorist attack gets handled without me for the next 2 weeks." He reached over to squeeze her hand gently. "I've missed too much already, Zara. I don't want to miss any more." The scene dissolved into a montage of their vacation, father and daughter exploring ancient temples together, laughing as they attempted to learn traditional dance, sharing quiet conversations on the beach as the sun painted the horizon in impossible colors. For perhaps the first time since her mother's death, Zara experienced her father's undivided attention. Not as FBI Director Brednum, but simply as Dad. In one particular moment, they sat on their villa's private deck overlooking the ocean. The tropical night wrapped around them like velvet. Stars scattered across the sky in constellations unfamiliar to American eyes, and the distant sound of traditional gamelan music floated on the warm breeze. "Do you think she learned anything?" Zara asked suddenly, the question seemingly coming from nowhere, but clearly referencing Bethany Caldwell. "Or will she just be angry about being humiliated?" Xavier considered this thoughtfully, appreciating his daughter's capacity for reflection, even about someone who had treated her so poorly. "People like that rarely change completely," he admitted, "but sometimes experiences like this create cracks in their certainty. Small openings where new understanding might eventually take root." "I hope so," Zara said quietly. "Not for her sake, but for her children's, if she has any. That kind of thinking hurts the people who hold it as much as the people it's directed against." For Bethany Caldwell, her lesson came through public humiliation and the recognition that her husband's career now hung in the precarious balance of Director Brednum's discretion. For Zara, it came through witnessing her father's principles in action, seeing that the same authority that so often took him away could also be wielded with restraint and wisdom. And for Xavier, it came through the recognition that no security briefing, no counterterrorism operation, no national emergency could ever be more important than being present for the moments that shaped his daughter's understanding of herself and her place in the world. If you enjoyed this story, like, subscribe and share to others so they can learn too. See you in our next video.